All right, in this video, I'm going over my all-time favorite book, Skin in the Game by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. In the book, he writes, learning is rooted in repetition and convexity, meaning that the reading of a single text twice is more profitable than reading two different things once, provided, of course, that said text has some depth of content. So I take this statement quite seriously. I've read Skin in the Game 7 times now, and even invented the Skin in the Game Index, an ETF based on the philosophy of this book. If you want to learn more about that, check out my website, insideownership.com. Okay, before I get into the book, check out what Naval Ravikant thinks about Skin in the Game.
Nassim has written books that I think people will be reading 1,000 years from now. His new book, Skin of the Game, is fantastic. It's part 5 in his Incerto series.
Wow, 1,000 years. The concepts of this book are timeless and rooted directly to human nature, and human nature doesn't change. As we dive into this book, you'll understand why Naval thinks people will be reading it 1,000 years from now. Skin of the Game covers 4 main topics. 1. Uncertainty and reliability of knowledge, or what Taleb calls BS detection. 2. Symmetry in human affairs, or fairness. 3. Information sharing in transactions. And 4. Rationality in complex systems and in the real world. Let's start with the introduction. He opens the book with a little Greek mythology. Antaeus, a sort of semi-giant, would pin his victims to the ground and crush them. His goal was to create a temple for his father using the skulls of his victims. His father, Poseidon, the god of the sea, and his mother was the planet Earth. He was deemed to be invincible, but he had a trick. He derived his strength from contact with his mother, Earth. Physically separated from contact, he lost all his powers. Hercules was sent to terminate the invincible Antaeus. He managed to do it by lifting Antaeus off his feet, so he lost contact with his mama, and he crushed him. Taleb uses this story as an analogy to knowledge. You cannot separate knowledge from contact with the ground or contact with the real world. And this contact is done via skin in the game, what the Greeks called pathemata mathemata, guide your learning through pain. The point is, those making decisions need to have contact with the consequences of their decisions. Otherwise, they never really learn. The idea of skin in the game is woven throughout history. Military leaders of the past didn't just order others into battle, they fought alongside them. Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and countless others led from the front lines, sharing the same dangers as the soldiers they commanded. Prominent people took risks, considerably more risk than ordinary people. Today, that relationship has been reversed. Politicians and corporate executives with suit can make decisions that affect millions of people while sometimes bearing no consequences to those decisions themselves. Think back to 2008. Bankers packaged and sold toxic mortgages, collecting enormous bonuses for taking hidden, asymmetric risks that were ultimately borne by the public. When the system collapsed, their bonuses were never clawed back. They used academic risk models that only work on paper and not in the real world. Because in academia, there's no difference between academia and the real world. In the real world, there is. Taleb presents a simple solution to these structural asymmetries: to localize decision making or to decentralize, because it's easier to macro BS than it is to micro BS. Decentralization reduces large structural asymmetries. I love this definition Taleb gives to bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is a construction by which a person is conveniently separated from the consequences of his or her actions. And once you create a system that separates people from consequences, you inevitably create a class of people willing to make decisions for everyone else. Taleb coins the term interventionistas to describe those who intervene in social affairs or other complex systems without bearing the consequences of their decisions. Think of those who advocate for war but never set foot on the battlefield, regulators who impose rules they will never have to live under, or policymakers whose failed ideas are paid for by everyone except for themselves. They enjoy the upside of influence and recognition while others bear the downside. In Taleb's view, the absence of skin in the game makes these interventions not only unfair, but often dangerous. This is what Taleb calls iatrogenics, those that do harm while trying to do good. Progress comes less from discovering what's right and more from eliminating what's wrong. Systems don't learn by adding, they learn by removing. Here's how nature actually works. Bad pilots are on the bottom of the Atlantic. Reckless drivers are in the cemetery. Transportation gets safer by removal. Taleb calls this via negativa, progress through elimination, not accumulation. Alex Hormozy captures this well. The fastest way to go fast is to remove what makes you slow. If you want to go fast, remove what makes you slow. But for a system to remove what isn't working, there has to be a mechanism that identifies failure. When someone makes a decision but never suffers the consequences of that decision, the system loses the ability to self-correct. The feedback loop breaks. The wrong people stay. The wrong ideas survive. The experience of the system is different from that of individuals. It is grounded in filtering. Individuals can hold on to bad ideas indefinitely, but systems exposed to reality will eventually filter out the people who hold on to them. Taleb puts it simply, you'll never convince someone they're wrong. Only reality can. And for 1,000 years, societies have understood this. 3,800 years ago, one of the earliest legal codes in history recognized the same principle. The ancient Babylonians etched 282 laws into a stone slab called Hammurabi's Code. The code has one central theme. It establishes symmetries between people in a transaction. And what was the most important one? If a builder builds a house and the house collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. Brutal, but think about what that does. It makes it physically impossible to offload hidden risk onto someone else. The builder cannot cut corners and walk away. He lives with the consequences of his own work. Taleb's point is we were more civilized 4,000 years ago than we are today. The rule is simple. If you can cause harm, you must be exposed to that harm. So what is the right way to treat other people? The golden rule says, treat others the way you want to be treated. Sounds wise. It sounds noble, but there's something more robust. The golden rule is aggressive. It assumes you know what's good for someone else. It gives you permission to impose with good intentions. But history is a graveyard of good intentions imposed on people who never asked for them. The silver rule flips it. Don't do unto others what you would not want done to yourself. That's it. One shift. Negative instead of positive. And it changes everything. Because we know with far more certainty what causes harm than what creates good. We know what we don't want. We are far less reliable about what others should want. The silver rule keeps you honest. It keeps you local. It keeps you out of other people's lives. Universal behavior is great on paper, but disastrous in practice. For example, you should conduct yourself toward your parents as you would have your children conduct themselves toward you. Isocrates warned us in 500 BC that nations should treat other nations according to the silver rule. Deal with weaker states as you think it appropriate for stronger states to deal with you. Skin in the game brings simplicity, and non-skin in the game people don't get simplicity. Things designed by people without skin in the game tend to grow in complication before their final collapse. People who sell complicated solutions do not have an incentive to implement simplified ones. There's absolutely no benefit for someone in such a position to propose something simple. When you are rewarded for perception, not results, you need to show sophistication. Warren Buffett talks a lot about the same idea when it comes to compensation consultants. Their entire profession is based on a certain perceived sophistication. Buffett prefers a compensation structure that can fit on one page, tied to at most two key variables. To quote Taleb, never pay for complexity of presentation when all you need is results. I want to say that one again for emphasis. Never pay for complexity of presentation when all you need is results. People have two brains, one when there's skin in the game, one when there's none. As Taleb says, when I don't have skin in the game, I'm usually dumb. Skin in the game can make boring things less boring. When you have skin in the game, dull things like checking the safety of an aircraft because you may be forced to be a passenger in it ceases to be boring. Drug addicts who go through rehab are told, should they spend half their mental energy trying to make money as they did procuring drugs, they're guaranteed to be millionaires. But to no avail. Without the addiction, the miraculous powers go away. This reveals an important truth. Incentives alone don't produce extraordinary effort. Something deeper does. There's something greater than skin in the game, and that's soul in the game. Skin in the game means you have something to lose. Soul in the game means you have something to protect. Your work becomes an extension of your identity. Your reputation, your pride, and your honor matter more than the paycheck. Artisans have their soul in the game. Things they would not do even if it made them richer. They wouldn't sell defective work, wouldn't cut corners, not because someone is watching, but because it would hurt their pride. Think about Steve Jobs obsessing over internal circuit boards of the original Mac. Components no customer would ever see. He insisted they'd be beautiful anyway. That's soul in the game. Entrepreneurs are heroes in our society. They fail for the rest of us, and companies beyond the entrepreneur stage start to rot. Let me say Taleb's words again. Quote unquote, companies beyond the entrepreneur stage start to rot. And maybe one reason is that entrepreneurs can afford to think differently. Jeff Bezos once said, if you want to be successful, and we do, you have to be willing to be misunderstood and to do things that don't seem sensible to most people. But imagine trying to do that without skin in the game. A hired manager rarely has the luxury of pursuing an idea that looks foolish to everyone else. When you don't own the consequences, you're often forced to justify every unconventional decision to people who may not see what you see. Skin in the game gives you the freedom to be misunderstood, which is why for me personally, I see a huge systemic skin in the game problem emerging with the rise of passive indexing. Think about the system we have created. Some of the largest companies in the world can be controlled by boards and executives who have purchased little, if any, stock with their own money. They can make decisions involving hundreds of billions of dollars while having relatively little of their own wealth at risk. Meanwhile, passive funds continue buying their stocks simply because the company remains in an index. The deeper problem, though, is accountability. In a healthy system, poor management should eventually face consequences. Owners challenge management, replace directors, or support someone they believe can run the company better. But as ownership becomes increasingly passive and dispersed, the ultimate owners become further removed from the companies they actually own. And this problem of mediocre management is nothing new. Warren Buffett called this out 30 years ago. Listen to what he said back in 1997.
The real sin is having a mediocre manager. That is what costs owners very significant amounts of money over time.
Now think about those words in context of today. Mediocre management was already difficult to remove when Buffett said that. The concern is that the rise of passive ownership has made the problem even more systemic. You can now have terrible boards locked in with no mechanism to have them removed. And a clear example of this is playing out right now with eBay and Ryan Cohen. Ryan Cohen co-founded Chewy, the online pet food retailer, and sold it for over $3 billion. Then later, he took control of GameStop and effectively turned around a dying business. Now, GameStop has made an offer to acquire eBay, and Cohen has said he wants to run the combined company himself. Now, I'm not an eBay shareholder, so I can't tell you whether Cohen's offer is a good deal for eBay owners. That's not really my point. My question is, how can a board who gets millions in board fees, who hasn't purchased any stock with their own money, decide if it's good for shareholders? Imagine what an entrepreneur like Ryan Cohen, someone with real soul in the game, and willing to put $500 million of his own money on the line, could do with a business like eBay. And this gets to the heart of the skin in the game problem. When the people making the decisions have relatively little of their own capital at risk, while the actual owners are increasingly passive and dispersed, the mechanism for correcting bad management becomes weaker. Entrepreneur has soul in the game. The shareholders have their money in the game, but increasingly, the people standing between them have neither. And that brings us back to the central idea of this entire book. You should never have the upside of making decisions without also sharing in the downside when those decisions go wrong. And that is exactly where Taleb begins in chapter 1, equality in uncertainty. He again uses a little Greek mythology to make his point. A group of fishermen caught a large number of turtles, and after cooking them, they found out that these sea animals were much less edible than they thought. But Mercury, the god of commerce, had been walking by. The group invited him to join them and offered him the turtles to eat. Detecting that he was only invited to relieve them of the unwanted food, he forced them all to eat the turtles, thus establishing the principle that you need to eat what you feed others. Basically, beware of the person who gives advice, telling you that a certain action on your part is good for you, while it is also good for him, while the harm to you doesn't directly affect him. Which brings us to asymmetry, the core concept behind skin in the game. The question becomes, to what extent can people in a transaction have an informational differential between them? For example, the question debated by two ancient Stoics: if a man knowingly offers for sale wine that is spoiling, ought he tell his customers? The world is getting closer to the position of transparency, not necessarily via regulations as much as thanks to tort laws, and one's ability to sue for harm in the event a seller deceives him or her. Tort laws put some of the seller's skin back into the game, which is why we are vastly better off complaining about having too many lawyers than complaining not having them. The ethical is always more robust than the legal. Over time, it is the legal that should converge to the ethical, never the reverse. Hence, laws come and go, ethics stay. Chapter 2: The Most Intolerant Wins. The Dominance of the Stubborn Minority. The main idea behind complex systems is that the collective behaves in ways not predicted by its components. The interactions matter more than the nature of the units. Studying individual ants will almost never give us a clear indication of how the ant colony operates. For that, one needs to understand the ant colony as an ant colony, no less, no more, not a collection of ants. This is called an emergent property of the whole, by which parts and whole differ because of what matters are the interactions between such parts, and interactions can obey very simple rules. The rule in this chapter is the minority rule, which Taleb calls the mother of all asymmetries. This is one of the most counterintuitive ideas of this entire book. Society does not evolve based on the preferences of the majority. It never has, and it never will. It evolves based on the preferences of the most intolerant minority. Napoleon said a version of this over 2 centuries ago. 10 people who yell make more noise than 10,000 who keep silent. Let me say that again. 10 people who yell make more noise than 10,000 who keep silent. Society doesn't move by consensus, voting, or majority opinion. It takes a small, immovable minority with real skin in the game to shift everything. Alexander the Great said that it was preferable to have an army of sheep led by a lion than an army of lions led by a sheep. Now, he said this over 2,000 years ago, but this can be applied to modern corporations today. Sam Hinkie said people are power law, and the best ones can change everything. Let me say that again. People are power law, and the best ones can change everything. And there's this other guy, Graham Duncan, who said a similar line. Talent is the best asset class. Just look at the most successful companies and you'll find clear examples of the power of the individual, where an owner-operator with soul in the game is able to inspire others to follow them on their mission. If you remove that person, the whole thing changes. Remove from an organization who made it great, and you removed what made it great. I'm going to say that again. Remove who made it great, and you removed what made it great. Taleb's idea is an uncompromising minority can shape the behavior of the majority. Here's Taleb's example. Less than 0.5% of Americans only drink kosher liquids, but almost all drinks produced in the US are kosher. Next time you grab a drink, look for the tiny U inside a circle. That's the kosher symbol, and it's on almost everything. Less than 0.5% of the population quietly set the standard for everyone else, and this scales to all of society. I came up with another example of the minority rule. Think of the more recent societal shift with the use of pronouns. A relatively small percentage of people identify as non-binary and use they/them pronouns, though many institutions have adopted the practices encouraging or normalizing pronoun sharing. And so an inflexible minority changes the default behavior of a much larger population. Find the stubborn minority in any market, and you've found the future. A tiny, intolerant minority can bend an entire system to its will. Think about the asymmetry with native English speakers. For example, if a meeting is taking place in a German conference room of a corporation that is sufficiently international or European, and one person in the room doesn't speak German, the entire meeting will be run in English. That way they can equally offend everyone. It all started with the asymmetric rule that those who are non-native in English know bad English, but the reverse, English speakers knowing other languages, is less likely. The larger and more centralized the system, the farther the preferences of a small but inflexible minority can spread. The United States works so well because it's a federation of 50 states, not a single centralized system. If it takes just 3% of the population for a stubborn minority to impose its preferences, then some states will cross that threshold while others won't. The result is diversity, different rules in different places. But if all 50 states were merged into one single political unit, the same 3% minority can impose its preferences on the entire country. And this idea of independence versus centralized controls takes us into chapter 3, how to legally own another person. In the early phase, as the church was starting to get established in Europe, there was a group of itinerant people called the gyrovagues. They were gyrating and roaming monks without any affiliation to any institution. The gyrovagues were unpopular with the church and banned. Why were they banned? They were simply totally free. They were financially free and secure, not because of their means, but because of their lack of wants. Ironically, by being beggars, they had the equivalent of FU money, which we can more easily get by being at the lowest class than by joining the income-dependent classes. Complete freedom is the last thing you want if you have an organized religion to run. Total freedom for employees is also a very bad thing if you have a firm to run. In short, every major corporation wants people who have so much to lose that they don't question authority. So how do you own these people? First, by conditioning and psychological manipulation. Second, by tweaking them to have some skin in the game, forcing them to have something significant to lose if they disobey authority. In the mafia, things are simple. Made men can be whacked, only if the capo suspects a lack of allegiance. For other professions, skin in the game comes in more subtle forms. The idea is more perks and status you get from someone else, you're more likely to be controlled. Of course, the most loyal employees are those you overpay and who knows it, terrified of losing their status. In the past, there was something called the company man. The company man is best defined as someone whose identity is impregnated with the stamp of the firm. He dresses the part, even uses the language the company expects. His social life is so invested in the company that leaving it inflicts a huge penalty. What matters isn't what a person has or doesn't have. It's what he or she is afraid of losing. The more you have to lose, the more fragile you are. Roman families customarily had a slave as a treasurer, the person responsible for the finances of the household and the estate. Why? Because you can inflict a much higher punishment on a slave than a free person, and you wouldn't have to rely on the mechanism of the law for that. However, there's a category of employees who aren't slaves. These are front office operators, or business generators. In a famous tale, the dog boasts to the wolf of all the contraptions of comfort and luxury he has, almost prompting the wolf to enlist, until the wolf asks the dog about his collar and is terrified when he understands its use. Of all your meals, I want nothing. He ran away and is still running. The question is, would you like to be a dog or a wolf? A dog's life may appear smooth and secure, but in the absence of an owner, a dog does not survive. A wolf is trained to survive. Taleb was asked why he didn't wear a tie, which he described at the time was the equivalent of walking down Fifth Avenue naked. His answer, 1 part arrogance, 1 part aesthetics, and 1 part convenience. If you were profitable, you can give managers all the crap you wanted, and they ate it because they needed you and were afraid of losing their own jobs. Risk takers can be socially unpredictable people. Freedom is always associated with risk-taking, whether it leads to it or comes from it. And risk takers take risks because it's in their nature to be wild animals. Okay, let's jump to chapter 6, the intellectual yet idiot, or for short, the IYI. IYI assumes something is wrong with others for doing things he doesn't understand, without ever realizing it is his understanding that may be limited. He thinks people should act according to their best interests, and he knows their interests. When the blue-collar working class do something that makes sense to themselves, but not to him, the IYI uses the term uneducated. Typically, IYI get first-order logic right, but not second-order effects, making him totally incompetent in complex domains. And this failure to understand second-order effects leads us to another problem. How do we know which ideas, technologies, or forms of expertise can actually be trusted? One answer is time. Chapter 8, an expert called Lindy. The Lindy Effect is one of the most powerful mental models in this entire book. It all started at a deli in New York. Decades ago, actors and mathematicians used to gather there, and they noticed something strange about Broadway shows. A show that had run for 100 days was likely to run for 100 more. A show that had survived 200 days, likely 200 more. The longer something had lasted, the longer it was expected to keep going. They called it the Lindy Effect. Here's the idea. For things that don't physically age, ideas, books, technologies, philosophies, time is the only honest judge. Every day something survives is proof that it can handle the real world, disorder, competition, change. Think about the knife and fork. We've been using them for roughly 2,000 years, which means odds are humans will still be using them 2,000 years from now. That which is Lindy is what ages in reverse, i.e., its life expectancy lengthens with time, conditional on survival. If Lindy teaches us to trust what has survived, the next chapter teaches us not to trust what merely looks the part. In a world obsessed by appearances, Taleb reminds us that competence often hides in plain sight. Chapter 9: Why Surgeons Should Not Look Like Surgeons. Imagine you need surgery. You walk in and meet two doctors. The first looks exactly like a surgeon. Silver-rimmed glasses, delicate hands, measured speech. Ivy League diplomas covering the wall. In fact, he would be the guy you hire to play a surgeon in a movie. The second guy looks like a butcher, overweight, shirt untucked. In a movie, you would expect him to impersonate a bodyguard. I assume they had the same successful track record. Who do you pick? Taleb argues we should take the butcher. Here's why. The surgeon who doesn't look the part yet built a successful career had to overcome something the polished guy never did. He was filtered by reality, not by appearances. His results had to speak for themselves because his image certainly wasn't doing him any favors. The elegant surgeon? He may have gotten where he is by navigating hierarchy, impressing committees, and playing the part well. His career may be built on looking right more than being right. Taleb's core point: when outcomes are decided by direct contact with reality, a patient either survives or doesn't, image becomes irrelevant. Reality is blind to looks, but when outcomes are decided by committees, evaluations, and hierarchies, image is everything. The lesson: when someone succeeds despite not fitting the mold, that's signal, not noise. Appearances can fool us. So can knowledge. Taleb's next lesson is that people who succeed often know something very different from what outsiders assume they need to know. Which brings us to the green lumber fallacy. There's a trader who made a very successful career trading a commodity called green lumber. He made a fortune, but there's just one problem. He thought green lumber meant lumber that was painted green. He had no idea it simply meant freshly cut wood. Meanwhile, the guy who told the story, he knew everything about green lumber, the forestry, the moisture content, the supply chains, and he went bankrupt. We assume that to succeed in any field, you need to understand that field, know the theory, know the terminology, know the details. But Taleb says that's a sucker trap. The knowledge that looks relevant, the kind you can explain in a polished presentation, is often not the knowledge that actually drives results. Taleb shares another example from his own experience as a trader. Many of the most successful Swiss franc traders couldn't even point out Switzerland on a map. They weren't experts in Swiss history, politics, or geography. What they understood was price action, risk, probabilities, and market behavior. They mastered the knowledge that actually produced results. Taleb puts it bluntly: what you need to know in the real world doesn't necessarily match what you can perceive through intellect. The fallacy isn't that details don't matter, it's that we consistently overweight the wrong details, the ones that sound good, look smart, and make for a clean narrative. Those are sucker traps. And that distinction between what actually produces results and what merely signals expertise extends far beyond trading. We often confuse appearances with substance, and nowhere is that more obvious than in the way we display our morality. Which brings us to Chapter 13, the merchandising of virtue, where Taleb turns his attention to those who publicly advertise their virtue while bearing little or no cost for it. In other words, your beliefs should have skin in the game. It is deeply hypocritical to publicly claim a moral position while privately exempting yourself from its consequences. One of the clearest examples I can personally think of is someone who publicly condemns abortion, but chooses to have one when the situation becomes personal. That is exactly the kind of moral posturing Taleb is attacking, the merchandising of virtue without accepting the price of living by it. To quote Taleb, if your private life conflicts with your intellectual opinion, it cancels your intellectual ideas, not your private life. That same confusion between what someone claims and what they actually live extends beyond virtue. We often mistake the appearance of something for the thing itself. Likewise, if you believe that you are helping the poor by spending money on PowerPoint presentations and international meetings, the type of meetings that lead to more meetings and PowerPoint presentations, you can completely ignore individuals. The poor become an abstract, reified construct that you do not encounter in your real life. This is what happens when knowledge becomes separated from direct experience. You can become an expert at discussing a problem without ever becoming particularly good at solving it. The system begins rewarding people for navigating the system rather than producing results. Taleb points out that the principal thing you can learn from a professor is how to become a professor, just as the chief thing you can learn from a life coach or inspirational speaker is how to become a life coach or inspirational speaker. But appearances can still matter. As Taleb puts it, a bishop on rollerblades would no longer be a bishop. There's nothing wrong with the decorative as long as we recognize it for what it is, decorative. The problem begins when we confuse the costume for competence, the signal for substance, or virtue signaling for virtue itself. And nowhere is the gap between words and consequences more dangerous than in matters of war and peace. That brings us to chapter 14, Peace, Neither Ink Nor Blood, where Taleb examines what happens when those shaping the fate of others have no skin in the game. Taleb argues that peace imposed from the outside, designed by bureaucrats and experts with no stake in the outcome, is often fragile. Lasting peace is more likely to emerge organically between people who must continue living alongside one another and who directly bear the consequences of conflict. Peace, in this sense, does not necessarily come from good intentions or agreements written in ink. It can emerge from repeated interaction, mutual dependence, and the simple reality that both sides have something to lose. And this principle goes even deeper than human conflict. As Taleb puts it, even in nature, predators end up in some kind of arrangement with their prey. I found that part super interesting. Predators end up with some sort of arrangement with their prey. I decided to go deeper into this subject and get a better idea of what Taleb was talking about. What Taleb means is that even predators are dependent on the prey for survival. If a predator becomes too effective at hunting, it can eventually wipe out its own food supply, and in doing so, threaten its own survival. We can imagine a prehistoric species so effective at hunting that it wiped out its own food supply and eventually went extinct itself. Nature would eliminate that predator along with its strategy. What survives, then, is a kind of equilibrium. Predators that are effective enough to survive, but not so effective that they destroy the very thing they depend on. So even predators and prey, despite being natural enemies, can end up in a kind of arrangement. Not because they cooperate or have some conscious agreement, but because their survival is intertwined. A similar dynamic exists in business. A corporation can become so dominant that over time, its dominance itself becomes a source of fragility. It may grow powerful enough to attract antitrust action from the government, or simply become so large and insulated from competition that bureaucracy takes over, innovation slows, and complacency sets in. Look at AT&T in its heyday was a government-enforced monopoly. They had physical copper wire traveling through virtually every home in the US. Who could compete with that? By the early 80s, it had become so dominant that the federal government ultimately broke it apart into 6 independent companies in an antitrust case. AT&T's monopoly had become so dominant that it stifled innovation. Even innovation from within its own walls. A handheld cell phone was pioneered outside the Bell system by Motorola. Healthy competition, then, is not necessarily the enemy of a successful corporation. In some ways, it is what keeps the corporation healthy. Just as a predator depends on the continued existence of its prey, a great company may depend on the competitive pressure that force it to remain hungry, innovative, and adaptable. Eliminate those pressures entirely, and the very dominance that made the company powerful can eventually become its greatest weakness. Okay, now the last chapter, and probably the most complicated, ergodicity. Now imagine 100 people walk into a casino. They each gamble the same amount. Some win, some lose. Gambler number 28 goes bust. Does that affect gambler number 29? No, they're independent. You can calculate the odds just fine across all 100. Now try this. One person walks into a casino 100 days in a row. On day 28, they go bust. Is there a day 29? No. Game over. Permanently. Same math, totally different outcomes. That's the difference between ensemble probability, what happens across a crowd at one moment, and time probability, what happens to one person over a sequence of events. Now, the best explanation of ergodicity I've heard is by a guy named Luca Delana, which I'll share here. Imagine a guy named David is entering a skiing competition consisting of 10 races. He's extremely fast and aggressive. He has a 20% chance of winning a race and a 20% chance of breaking his leg. How many races is he expected to win out of the 10? The naive answer would be that he's expected to win 2 races. Remember that he can only win race number 2 if he doesn't break his leg in race number 1. And he can only participate in race number 3 if he survives the previous 2 races. It's not the fastest skier that wins the race. It's the fastest skier that actually makes it to the finish line that wins. Something Lucas says that I love. Performance is subordinate to survival. I'll say that again for emphasis. Performance is subordinate to survival. Survival comes first. Truth, understanding, and science come later. Never confuse what works on average with what works over time. To quote Taleb, never cross a river that's on average 4 feet deep. Consider the strategy used by several exchange-traded products that sold volatility. For years, they collected large premiums and produced impressive average returns. Then, in February 2018, a sudden market correction caused volatility to explode, overnight wiping out 96% of their capital. Game over. The ETNs were shut down. Those funds will never have the opportunity to earn the market average rate of return. This is the lesson of ergodicity. Averages mean nothing if you do not survive long enough to experience them. And with that, we reached the end of Skin of the Game. This is one of those rare books that changes the way you see the world. After reading it, I think you'll agree with Naval, it being a 1,000-year book. If you enjoyed this summary and found it valuable, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know your biggest takeaway in the comments below. I'd love to hear which idea from the book resonated with you the most. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.